On a humid afternoon in October 2024, just outside the city limits of Fayetteville, North Carolina, a promise was made that should have sent a chill down the spine of every American who believes in justice. Speaking to a roaring crowd of supporters, Donald Trump looked toward the sprawling military installation just a few miles away, the home of the legendary 82nd Airborne Division and the U.S. Army Special Forces, and declared a war on history. He was not talking about funding, or strategy, or troop levels. He was talking about a name. "We are going to bring it back," he vowed, his voice cutting through the applause. "We are going to call it Fort Bragg again. Because you do not change history. You do not cancel our heritage." To the casual observer, this might have sounded like standard political theater. But to those who know the truth, it was a desecration. Because the name Fort Bragg does not honor an American hero. It honors Braxton Bragg, a Confederate general who not only fought treasonously against the United States to preserve the institution of slavery but was also, by the account of nearly every historian and contemporary peer, a catastrophic failure as a military commander. He was a man hated by his own troops, a strategist who lost almost every battle he engaged in, and a slave owner who viewed black human beings as livestock. Restoring his name would not be an act of heritage. It would be an act of resurrection for an ideology the country supposedly defeated in 1865. But the true tragedy of this moment is not just about the return of a Confederate ghost. It is about the hero who was shoved aside to make room for him. In 2022, the United States had a golden, once-in-a-century opportunity to bury the legacy of Braxton Bragg forever and replace it with a name that actually embodied the spirit of the airborne forces. There was one candidate that stood head and shoulders above the rest. One name that carried the weight of blood, sacrifice, and supreme excellence. It was a name that would have honored the Triple Nickels, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion. They were the first. The originals. The pioneers who proved that black men could jump from the sky and fight with an elite fury that rivaled any white unit. They earned their silver wings in the face of a Jim Crow army that wanted them to fail. They were the spiritual ancestors of every paratrooper jumping today. Renaming the base Fort Triple Nickel would have been more than a gesture. It would have been a correction of the historical record, a permanent monument to men who loved a country that refused to love them back. But the system blinked. The Congressional Naming Commission, created in the wake of the George Floyd protests to purge Confederate names from military assets, faced a choice between courage and comfort. They looked at the legacy of the Triple Nickels, they looked at the political climate, and they chose the path of least resistance. They rejected Fort Triple Nickel. Instead, on June 2, 2023, the base was officially redesignated Fort Liberty. Liberty. It sounds noble. It sounds unassailable. Who could argue with liberty? But in the context of history, liberty is a hollow, corporate abstraction. It is a safe word chosen by bureaucrats terrified of offending a conservative base that views any recognition of black history as woke ideology. By choosing an abstract concept instead of honoring the specific, flesh and blood black men who made the airborne forces what they are, the Commission committed a quiet, polite act of erasure. They washed the history clean. They said, "We will stop honoring the slave owner, but we will not start honoring the black liberator. We will choose nothing." If there are still some true patriots out there, drop your state and city in the comments. This decision, this bureaucratic cowardice, as some activists called it, created the very vacuum that Donald Trump is now exploiting. If the base had been named Fort Triple Nickel, if it had been named after a specific hero like Sergeant First Class Lawrence Lambert, the first black man to jump from a U.S. military plane, restoring the name Bragg would have required explicitly tearing down a black war hero. It would have been an open act of racial aggression. But tearing down Fort Liberty? That is easy. That can be framed as anti-woke, as restoring tradition, as fighting political correctness. By choosing a safe name, the Commission left the door unlocked for the Confederates to walk right back in. And make no mistake, the plan to restore the name is not just a campaign slogan. It is a strategic maneuver that mirrors the exact tactics used to erase the panels at the Netherlands American Cemetery. The 2021 National Defense Authorization Act legally prohibits the Defense Department from naming assets after Confederates. Trump cannot simply sign a paper and honor Braxton Bragg again. The law is clear. But laws have loopholes, and the incoming administration has reportedly already drafted the workaround. They will not name it after General Braxton Bragg. They will find a Private William Bragg or a Corporal Thomas Bragg, some obscure, white service member from a different war who happens to share the last name, and they will dedicate the base to him. The signs on the highway will simply say Fort Bragg again. The casual culture of the base will revert. The wink and nod to the Confederacy will be restored, shielded by a technicality that laughs in the face of the lawless intent. It is a cynical, sophisticated game of three-card monte with American history. And the victims of this game are the men of the 555th. This is the triple betrayal. First, in the 1940s, they were betrayed by an army that trained them to be elite killers but refused to send them to fight the Nazis because the optics of armed black heroes were too dangerous for the status quo. Second, in 2023, they were betrayed by a commission that admitted their heroism but refused to put their name on the gate, choosing a safe abstraction instead. And now, they face a third betrayal. The prospect that the base they helped build, the airborne tradition they helped forge, will once again bear the name of a man who would have considered them property. The tragedy is that the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion was, by every metric, the perfect candidate for this honor. Their story is not just black history. It is the quintessential American story of grit, innovation, and overcoming impossible odds. They were not just soldiers. They were test pilots for a new kind of warfare. They were the first to prove that you could drop a platoon of men into a forest fire and fight it from the inside out, a mission so dangerous it was dubbed Operation Firefly. They took on a secret war on the American homeland while their white counterparts were shipping out to Normandy. They jumped into burning timber with primitive gear, facing death not from German machine guns, but from exploding trees and suffocating smoke, all to protect the Pacific Northwest from a terror weapon launched by Imperial Japan. And yet, you will not find their name on the main gate of the home of the Airborne. You will find liberty. A word that meant very different things to the white officers who commanded Fort Bragg in 1944 and the black troopers who were segregated in its barracks. To understand why this current political battle is so offensive, you have to understand who these men were. You have to understand the sheer, unadulterated excellence they brought to a world that wanted them to be mediocre. They were the triple nickels. They did not just want to serve, they wanted to fly. And the story of how they earned their wings, and how the country they served thanked them with silence, is one of the most infuriating and heroic chapters in the archives of the United States Army. The year is 1943. The place is Fort Benning, Georgia, and a group of 20 men is standing at the base of a 250-foot steel tower, looking up at a sky that strictly forbade their presence. They are about to do something that the War Department said was impossible. They are about to prove that a black man can jump. To fully grasp the magnitude of the betrayal happening today, you have to go back to the moment of Genesis. You have to understand that the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion did not begin as a unit. It began as an argument. In 1943, the United States Army was a rigid, white supremacist institution. It was an army that believed, as a matter of official doctrine, that African Americans were intellectually inferior, prone to panic, and lacking the aggressive spirit necessary for modern combat. They were relegated to the motor pool, the kitchen, and the latrine detail. The idea of a black paratrooper, a soldier required to possess peak physical conditioning, supreme intelligence, and the raw nerve to jump out of a moving plane behind enemy lines, was considered a joke by the top brass at the Pentagon. But the pressure was mounting. The WWII campaign, led by black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, was demanding victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. They demanded combat roles for black men. The War Department, backed into a political corner, finally relented. They authorized the activation of a test platoon. But make no mistake, this was not an opportunity given in good faith. It was set up to fail. The unspoken expectation among the white officers at Fort Benning was that these men would wash out. They expected them to quit. They expected the terror of the jump tower to break them. They wanted to be able to point to a failed experiment and say, "See? We told you they could not do it." They did not know who was coming. The men who volunteered for the 555th were not ordinary draftees. They were a hand-picked cadre of the hardest, most ambitious men Black America had to offer. Many came from the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, already hardened by service. They were former university athletes, construction workers from the steel mills of the Midwest, and farm boys who had survived the crushing labor of the Deep South. They were physically imposing and mentally razor-sharp. They knew exactly what the test was. They knew that every push-up, every run, Every inspection was being scrutinized by men who hated them. They knew that one slip-up, one moment of hesitation in the door of the plane, would be used to indict their entire race. The training at Fort Benning was designed to break human beings. It was a punishing, relentless cycle of physical abuse. The daily dozen exercises, the 4-mile runs in formation under the Georgia sun, the hours of hand-to-hand combat drills. 4 white paratroopers, this was hard. For the men of the 555th, it was a daily war for survival. They were segregated in the barracks, forced to live in inferior conditions, yet expected to outperform the white unit's training just across the road. And they did. They developed a culture of hyper-excellence. If the standard was 50 push-ups, they did 100. If the run was 4 miles, they sprinted the last mile. They ran with a cadence that became legendary at Benning, a rhythmic, stomping chant that announced their presence long before they came into view. They were not just training, they were performing. They were forcing the white instructors to respect them. The ultimate test was the 250-foot jump towers. These steel monstrosities dominated the skyline of Fort Benning. Trainees were strapped into a parachute harness, hoisted to the top, and then dropped. It was a gut check. It was the moment where gravity and fear collided. For the men of the 555th, it was also the moment where the psychological warfare of the Army peaked. White soldiers and officers would gather to watch, some betting on whether the colored boys would freeze. They waited for the scream, the refusal, the panic. It never came. One by one, the men of the 555th stepped into the void with stone-cold precision. They mastered the body position, feet and knees together, elbows in, chin on chest. They hit the ground, rolled, and sprang up ready to fight. They turned the terrifying into the routine. Of the 20 men in that original test platoon, not a single one washed out. It was a 100% success rate, a statistic that was virtually unheard of in the airborne schools. On February 18, 1944, 16 men from that platoon graduated. They pinned the coveted silver wings of the American paratrooper to their chests. It was a seismic moment. They had breached the inner sanctum of the military elite. They were no longer just soldiers, they were paratroopers. The test was over, and the result was undeniable. The Army authorized the creation of a full battalion. The unit was designated the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion. But they needed a name. A number was not enough for the swagger and the pride these men carried. The number 555 resonated with them. 555. In the slang of the time, the nickname for a 5-cent coin, a nickel, was common currency. 3 fives. The triple nickels. The name stuck. It sounded lucky, it sounded cool, and it sounded like them. They adopted a patch, a buffalo, honoring their predecessors, but with a parachute strapped to its back. The symbolism was clear. They were the new generation of buffalo soldiers, taking the fight to the skies. By late 1944, the triple nickels had grown to a force of over 400 men. They were a finely tuned machine. They were fully trained in infantry tactics, demolition, and airborne assault. They were arguably the fittest unit in the entire United States Army. They watched with hunger as the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions jumped into Normandy on D-Day. They saw the newsreels of Operation Market Garden. They knew the war in Europe was reaching its climax, and they were desperate to be there. They wanted to kill Nazis. They wanted to liberate Europe. They wanted to prove that their silver wings were not just jewelry. But as the weeks turned into months, a disturbing silence settled over their barracks. The orders did not come. They ran their miles, they packed their chutes, they cleaned their rifles until the metal wore thin, but the phone did not ring. The 82nd Airborne was being bled white in the hedgerows of France, desperate for replacements. The triple nickels was sitting in North Carolina, fully trained and ready to go. Why? The answer was a mix of cowardice and politics that defines the American experience of that era. Commanders in the European theater were terrified of the optics. The idea of a cohesive, armed, elite black unit operating in France was a nightmare for the segregated military hierarchy. What if they performed too well? What if they returned home as conquering heroes? What if they dated white French women? General Lee, commanding the logistics in Europe, and others in the high command, effectively blocked their deployment. They would rather let white soldiers die for lack of reinforcement than integrate the front lines with black paratroopers. The frustration within the triple nickels was explosive. They were stationed in purgatory. They had conquered the air, but they could not conquer the color line. They were elite warriors being treated like a museum exhibit. Look, but do not touch. Look at what we allow them to become, but do not let them actually do anything. And then, just as morale threatened to collapse, a new mission appeared. It was strange. It was top secret. And it was not in Europe. It was on the other side of the country, in the dense, ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest. The War Department did not want them fighting Germans. But there was another enemy, a silent, bizarre enemy that was attacking the American homeland in a way no one had predicted. The triple nickels were about to be deployed. Not to the Battle of the Bulge, but to Oregon. They were about to trade their M1 Garans for Mac Leods and Pulaskis, firefighting tools. They were about to become the pioneers of a completely new form of warfare, jumping into burning forests to fight an enemy that fell from the sky on silent balloons. It was a mission that would require even more courage than storming a bunker, because if they died in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest, no one would ever know. They were being sent into a secret war, a war that the government wanted to keep quiet to avoid panic. The triple nickels were finally going into combat, but their battlefield would be unlike anything in the history of warfare. And the risks they were about to take would earn them a place in history that the Fort Liberty Commission chose to ignore. In May of 1945, the war in Europe ended. The Third Reich collapsed, and the newsreels were filled with images of white American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne celebrating in the ruins of Berlin, drinking cognac, and shaking hands with the Russians. For the men of the triple nickels, still stationed in the United States, VE Day was a bitter pill. They had missed the show. They had trained for 2 years to fight fascism, to prove their valor on the world stage, and they had been left on the bench. But just as the guns fell silent in Germany, a new, bizarre, and silent threat was materializing over the western skies of the United States. And the triple nickels were finally going to get their deployment orders. Their destination was not the Rhine River or the hedgerows of Normandy. It was Pendleton, Oregon. Their mission was classified. Their enemy was not the Wehrmacht, but a terror weapon that sounded like science fiction, the Fugo balloon bomb. By late 1944, Imperial Japan was desperate. The American Navy was closing in on their home islands. In a last-ditch effort to strike back at the American mainland, Japanese scientists had engineered an intercontinental weapon system that was decades ahead of its time. They launched over 9,000 hydrogen-filled paper balloons into the high-altitude jet stream, a wind current that the world was only just beginning to understand. These silent killers floated across the Pacific Ocean, carrying incendiary devices and anti-personnel bombs. They were designed to drift over the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, drop their payload, and ignite massive, uncontrollable wildfires that would consume cities, divert American war resources, and spread panic across the civilian population. It was a terrifying concept. A silent invasion from the sky. And it was working. On May 5, 1945, a woman named Elsie Mitchell and 5 children were on a church picnic in Oregon. They found a strange object in the woods. When they touched it, it exploded, killing all 6 of them instantly. They were the only combat casualties of World War II on the continental United States. The government, terrified of mass hysteria, clamped a total news blackout on the balloon bombs. The public was not told, but the military knew they had a crisis on their hands. The dry summer season was approaching, and hundreds of these incendiary balloons were drifting toward the massive timber reserves of Oregon, Washington, and California. They needed a rapid response force. They needed men who were physically tough, highly disciplined, and capable of jumping out of planes into the most rugged, inaccessible terrain in North America. They did not need firefighters. They needed warriors who could learn to fight fire. And so, the call went to the 555th. The irony was staggering. The army did not trust black men to hold a rifle in a trench in France, but they were perfectly willing to let them jump into a burning forest in Oregon to save the nation's lumber supply. They were Operation Firefly. The transition from combat paratrooper to smoke jumper was jarring. The triple nickels had trained to jump into open fields, hit the ground rolling, and open fire. Smoke jumping was the exact opposite. You were not aiming for the clearing. You were aiming for the trees. The forests of the Pacific Northwest are not like the woods of Georgia. They are ancient, dense, and vertical. Douglas firs and ponderosa pines tower 200 feet into the air, growing on slopes so steep a man can barely stand. The strategy was insane. Guide your parachute into the trees, intentionally crash through the branches, hope your canopy snags on a limb, and then use a rope to rappel 100 feet down to the forest floor. Their equipment was primitive. They traded their steel combat helmets for modified football helmets with wire mesh face masks, essentially fencing masks, to protect their eyes from gouging branches. They wore heavy fleece-lined jackets and reinforced trousers that made them look like padded giants. They carried 50 pounds of firefighting gear, Pulaski axes, shovels, and crosscut saws. And they carried something else, the knowledge that if they got hurt, help was days away. There were no medics in the extraction helicopters, because there were no helicopters. If you broke a leg in the remote wilderness, your buddies had to carry you out on a stretcher, hiking miles through mountainous terrain. The Triple Nickels arrived in Oregon and were given a crash course by the U.S. Forest Service. Within weeks, they were airborne. For the summer and fall of 1945, while the rest of the country celebrated the end of the war, the men of the 555th were fighting a desperate, secret battle. They responded to over 36 fires. They jumped into smoke-choked valleys where the heat was so intense it could melt the soles of their boots. They dug fire lines by hand, working 20-hour shifts, choking on ash, their sweat turning to mud on their faces. Describe a jump for a moment. Imagine standing in the door of a C-47 transport plane, the air filled with the smell of burning pine. Below you is a carpet of green, broken only by the angry orange scar of a fire. You jump. The wind catches you. But instead of the smooth descent to a drop zone, you are hurtling toward a canopy of jagged timber. You cross your legs, cover your face, and brace for impact. Crash. Branches whip against your body. You are violently jerked to a halt, dangling 80 feet in the air, swaying in the wind. You look down. The fire is crackling below you. You have to unhook, attach your rope, and lower yourself into the inferno. And then, once you on the ground, the real work begins. You fight the fire with hand tools, cutting away the fuel, starving the beast. You do not sleep. You do not stop. They proved to be naturals. Their physical conditioning from Fort Benning made them superior to the civilian smoke jumpers. They could hike further, dig faster, and endure more punishment. They disarmed Japanese bombs they found in the woods, handling explosives with the cool nerve of the demolition experts they were trained to be. They saved millions of dollars in timber. They protected the communities of the Northwest from devastation. But this secret war had a cost. On August 6, 1945, the same day the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the 555th suffered its first casualty. His name was Melvin Brown. He was a medic, a man who had enlisted to save lives. On a jump near Lemon Butte in the Umpqua National Forest, Brown was dropped into a treacherous section of timber. The wind was unpredictable. He missed his target. He landed miles from the drop zone, crashing into the top of a massive fir tree. His chute snagged, but then, tragically, it slipped. Melvin Brown fell 150 feet to the rocky ground below. He died alone in the wilderness, thousands of miles from home, fighting a fire started by an enemy he never saw. Melvin Brown was the first smoke jumper to die in the line of duty. His death is a footnote in the history books, overshadowed by the mushroom cloud that rose over Japan on the very same day. There were no headlines for him. No pirates. His body was quietly recovered by his brothers in the 555th. They mourned him in the barracks, a private grief for a public sacrifice. This is the essence of the Triple Nickels story during the war. They served in silence. They jumped into danger over 1,200 times that season. They faced death in the air and on the ground. And they did it all while knowing that the towns they were saving, the small, white communities of rural Oregon and Washington, were often sundown towns where a black man was not welcome after dark. They protected people who would not have let them sit at their dinner tables. When the war ended in August 1945, the Triple Nickels had performed a miracle. They had successfully transitioned from infantry to airborne firefighters without losing their unit cohesion or their pride. They had proven that they could handle any mission, no matter how unconventional or dangerous. They had defended the American homeland in the most literal sense possible. They expected, perhaps naively, that this service would count for something. They thought that when they returned to Fort Bragg, things might be different. They had wings on their chests. They had combat stars on their records. They had saved the West. But as they packed up their gear in Oregon and boarded the trains back to North Carolina, They were leaving the clean air of the mountains and heading back into the suffocating atmosphere of the Jim Crow South. The Army was done with Operation Firefly. The secret war was over. And now, the Army had to decide what to do with an elite battalion of black paratroopers in a peacetime military that still wanted to keep them separate and unequal. The Triple Nickels were about to face their next great test, the false promise of integration. They were about to march into a parade that looked like a victory, but felt like a funeral for their history. On January 12, 1946, New York City threw the biggest party in the history of the world. The victory parade for the 82nd Airborne Division. The All-Americans. The heroes of Sicily, Salerno, Normandy, and Nijmegen. 4 million people lined Fifth Avenue, a sea of cheering faces, waving flags and weeping with joy as the conquerors of the Third Reich marched in perfect cadence. And there, right in the middle of this river of heroes, was a sight that stunned the crowd. A phalanx of black soldiers, marching with a snap and a swagger that matched the legendary 82nd step for step. It was the Triple Nickels. General James "Jumpin' Jim" Gavin, the charismatic young commander of the 82nd, had personally invited them. He had seen them train. He knew they had not fought in Europe, but he respected their discipline. He wanted the world to see that the Airborne was not just a white fraternity. As the Triple Nickels marched past the reviewing stand, past the skyscrapers, past the adoring crowds, it felt like a breakthrough. It felt like the WWII campaign had won. They were being applauded by white America. They were being welcomed into the brotherhood of the elite. But parades are illusions. They are theater. And when the confetti was swept away and the music faded, the Triple Nickels found themselves on a train back to North Carolina, back to reality. The applause of Fifth Avenue did not follow them across the Mason-Dixon line. When they stepped off the train at Fort Bragg, they were not heroes. They were just niggers in uniform again. The post-war period at Fort Bragg was a strange, tense purgatory. The Army was shrinking, shedding millions of draftees, but the Triple Nickels re-enlisted. They were professionals. They wanted a career. But the Army did not know what to do with them. They were an anomaly, an all-black tactical unit in a military that was theoretically moving toward integration but was practically paralyzed by racism. Then came Executive Order 9981. In July 1948, President Harry Truman ordered the desegregation of the armed forces. History books often paint this as a moment of instant moral awakening, a magic wand that erased prejudice. The reality was messy, resistant, and for the Triple Nickels, ultimately destructive. For the Army hierarchy, integration was not about equality, it was about efficiency. Maintaining separate black units was expensive and logistically difficult. It was easier to simply absorb them. General Gavin, true to his progressive reputation, wanted the Triple Nickels. He wanted to integrate the 82nd Airborne Division. On December 15, 1947, in a ceremony that was both a promotion and a funeral, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion was formally deactivated. The Triple Nickels ceased to exist. Their colors were furled and put away in a crate. The men were redesignated as the 3rd Battalion of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. On paper, this was a victory. Black soldiers were finally serving in the legendary 82nd Airborne, the most prestigious division in the Army. They were wearing the AA patch. They were integrated. But in practice, it was an erasure. By absorbing them, the Army diluted their history. They were no longer a unique, standalone unit with their own identity, their own commanders, and their own legacy. They were just black faces scattered into a white sea. The name Triple Nickel began to fade, replaced by the generic anonymity of the rank and file. And the integration at Fort Bragg was hostile. The base itself remained a bastion of the Old South. The black paratroopers now lived in the same barracks as white soldiers, slept in the same bunks, and ate in the same mess halls. For many white soldiers, particularly those from the South, this was an abomination. Tensions were razor-thin. Fistfights were common. Black sergeants found their orders ignored by white privates. Black officers were saluted with reluctance, or not at all. There is a story from this era that perfectly encapsulates the schizophrenia of the time. The 82nd Airborne was integrated on duty. They jumped together, trained together, and marched together. But the moment the duty day ended, the integration stopped. The swimming pools on base were still segregated. The officers' clubs were restricted. A black paratrooper could save a white paratrooper's life during a training jump at 2:00 p.m., but he could not buy him a beer at the club at 6:00 p.m. They were soldiers by day and second-class citizens by night. The final insult came with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. This was the first war fought by a racially integrated American army. The veterans of the Triple Nickels, now dispersed throughout the 82nd and other units like the 187th Regimental Combat Team, finally got their chance to fight a foreign enemy. They jumped into combat at places like Suction and Suncheon. They fought in the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir. They died on the hills of Korea, bleeding the same red blood as the white men beside them. They proved, once and for all, that the hesitation to send them to Europe in 1944 had been a lie. They were magnificent in combat. But because the 555th had been disbanded, there were no headlines about the Triple Nickels winning battles. There were no unit citations for the 555th. The credit went to the 82nd Airborne, to the Army as a whole. The specific, heroic contribution of the black paratrooper was swallowed up by the institution. The Army took their talent, their courage, and their lives, but it buried their name. This is the mechanism of erasure. It does not always happen with a ban. Sometimes it happens with a merger. By the late 1950s, the memory of the Triple Nickels was fading. They were becoming a rumor, a story told by old men in barbershops, but absent from the official histories. The Army was happy to use photos of black paratroopers to show how progressive it was, but it refused to honor the specific unit that had made that progress possible. This erasure laid the groundwork for the betrayal of 2022. When the Naming Commission looked at Fort Bragg, they saw a Confederate problem. They needed a new name. If the 555th had remained a distinct, celebrated unit, like the Tuskegee Airmen or the Harlem Hellfighters, it would have been politically impossible to ignore them. But because the Army had spent 70 years dissolving their identity into the mainstream, the Commission felt safe in bypassing them. They viewed the Triple Nickels not as a legendary battalion, but as a niche historical footnote. The decision to choose Fort Liberty instead of Fort Triple Nickel was the direct result of this decades-long process of dilution. The Commission argued that liberty was inclusive, that it represented everyone. But liberty is safe. Liberty demands nothing of us. Naming the base Fort Triple Nickel would have forced the Army to confront its own history. It would have forced every soldier walking through those gates to ask, who were they? Why were they separate? Why did not we send them to Europe? It would have been a daily history lesson in the racism of the institution. Fort Liberty allows the Army to pretend that it has always been a beacon of freedom. It papers over the cracks. It hides the scars. It is a name that looks forward without acknowledging the pain of the past. And for the surviving families of the Triple Nickels, for the black veterans who know the truth, it was a slap in the face. It was the Army saying, we will take your service, but we will not take your name. And now, that safe, hollow choice has backfired spectacularly. Because liberty has no defenders. No one feels a deep, tribal loyalty to an abstract concept. By stripping the base of a specific, heroic identity, the Commission created a vacuum. And into that vacuum steps Donald Trump, with a specific, powerful, and toxic identity, Braxton Bragg. He offers a return to tradition, a return to a name that, for millions of white Americans, feels like heritage. If the base had been named for the Triple Nickels, restoring the name Bragg would be an explicit act of racism, replacing black heroes with a white supremacist. It would be a PR nightmare. But replacing liberty with Bragg? That can be sold as anti-woke. That can be sold as correcting a mistake. The Commission's cowardice in 2022 did not just fail to honor the Triple Nickels, it paved the way for the return of the Confederates in 2025. The Triple Nickels were dangerous to the Army in 1945 because they represented armed black power. They are dangerous to the political establishment today because they represent a specific, undeniable truth about American racism that cannot be smoothed over with words like liberty. They are the ghosts at the feast. And as we look toward a future where the name of a traitor might once again adorn the home of the Airborne, we have to ask ourselves, why is America so afraid of this number? 5. 5. 5. What is it about these men that makes the system work so hard, generation after generation, to ensure they remain forgotten? The answer lies not in the past, but in the present political war for the soul of the military. Fast forward 70 years. The world has changed, or at least, the surface of it has. The year is 2020. The murder of George Floyd has ignited a firestorm of reckoning across the United States. Monuments to Confederate generals, stone idols erected to intimidate and humiliate, are being toppled in town squares from Richmond to New Orleans. The military, an institution that prides itself on tradition but rests on a foundation of diverse manpower, can no longer ignore the rot at its core. It is finally forced to confront the absurdity that 9 of its most significant bases, including the crown jewel of the Airborne, Fort Bragg, are named after men who killed American soldiers to defend slavery. Congress acts. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2021 mandates the creation of a naming commission. Their orders are clear: remove the names of Confederates. Find new names that inspire, that reflect the values of the modern army, that honor true heroism. For Fort Bragg, the stakes were higher than anywhere else. This was not just a training post. It was the center of the universe for the U.S. Army. It is the home of the Special Forces and the 82nd Airborne. The name on those gates carries global weight. The process began with a surge of hope. The commission received over 34,000 suggestions from the public. Among the finalists, the stories were staggering. There was Roy Benavides, a Hispanic Special Forces legend who had survived 37 separate bayonet, bullet, and shrapnel wounds in Vietnam to save his team. There was Alvin York, the pacifist who became the greatest hero of World War I. But for many historians, veterans, and activists, there was one option that felt destined. One option that healed the specific wound of Fort Bragg's history: Fort Triple Nickel. It was perfect. It honored a unit, not just a man, fitting for the collaborative spirit of the Airborne. It honored black pioneers in a state, North Carolina, that had been a stronghold of the Confederacy. It replaced the name of a man who fought to enslave black people with the name of a unit of black men who fought to save the country. It was poetic justice. It was a chance to say to the ghosts of Malvern Brown and the men who were denied their shot at Hitler, "We see you. We honor you. You are the standard." But as the commission deliberated behind closed doors, a different kind of calculus began to take hold. It was the calculus of caution. The calculus of the boardroom. The commissioners were under immense pressure. The political right was already screaming about wokeism and erasing history. The political left demanded representation. The military brass just wanted something that would not cause a PR headache. They looked at Fort Triple Nickel and they hesitated. Perhaps they feared it was too specific. Perhaps they worried that honoring a segregated unit would remind people of the segregation itself. Perhaps, in the cynical quiet of the committee room, they worried that white soldiers from the Deep South would not want to serve at a base named explicitly for black excellence. We may never know the exact conversations, but we know the result. On May 24, 2022, the Naming Commission released its recommendations. They renamed Fort Hood after Richard Cavazos, a Hispanic hero. They renamed Fort Benning after Hal and Julie Moore, a white couple. They renamed Fort Gordon after Dwight Eisenhower. They chose specific, heroic individuals for almost every base, except Fort Bragg. For the most important base of all, they chose Fort Liberty. The explanation was wrapped in soaring rhetoric. Liberty, the report read, is the greatest American value. It remains the watchword of the 82nd Airborne Division. It is inclusive. It honors everyone. But everyone is a lie. Everyone is a hiding place. The choice of Fort Liberty was a profound act of bureaucratic cowardice. By choosing an abstract concept instead of a person or a unit, the Commission sterilized the history. A concept cannot bleed. A concept cannot be segregated. A concept cannot be betrayed. By naming the base Liberty, they avoided the messy, uncomfortable, and necessary conversation about who had been denied liberty in that very location. It was the all lives matter of military naming conventions. By trying to include everyone, they honored no one. For the surviving families of the Triple Nickels, and for the black paratroopers who walk in their footsteps today, the decision was a gut punch. It was a message that their specific history, their specific struggle, was still considered too divisive for the main stage. The Army was willing to put the Triple Nickels in a museum exhibit. They were willing to put them on a commemorative coin. But they were not willing to put them on the gate. They were not willing to force every soldier, from the private to the general, to say their name every single day. One retired black officer, speaking on condition of anonymity, put it brutally: They gave us a noun because they were afraid of a black proper noun. They replaced a white supremacist with a dictionary definition. That's not progress. That's avoidance. But the strategic failure of Fort Liberty goes beyond the insult to the triple nickels. It created a fatal political weakness. In their desperate attempt to be safe, to choose a name that no one could object to, the Commission chose a name that no one would fight for. Think about it. If they had named it Fort Benavides, attacking the name would mean attacking a Medal of Honor recipient who bled for this country. It would be political suicide to say, take down the name of this Hispanic war hero. If they had named it Fort Triple Nickel, restoring the name Bragg would require a politician to stand up and say, I want to take the name of these black pioneers off the gate and put a Confederate slave owner back up. The optics would be monstrous. The name itself would have been a shield, protected by the moral weight of the heroes it honored. But Fort Liberty. Who defends Fort Liberty with passion? It feels like a corporate rebrand, like a sports stadium named after a bank. It has no soul. It has no blood in the soil. And this brings us to the present crisis. This is exactly why Donald Trump and his allies feel emboldened to attack it. They are not attacking a hero. They are attacking a woke abstraction. They can frame Fort Liberty as a generic, PC erasure of tradition. They can argue that Bragg is a name of martial history, ignoring Bragg's actual incompetence, while liberty is just a buzzword. The Commissionists' attempt to be non-controversial has backfired in the most spectacular way possible. By trying to appease the people who hate change, they gave those very people the ammunition to reverse it. They built a house of straw instead of a fortress of stone. This is the second betrayal. The first was in 1945, when the Army said the triple nickels were too dangerous to fight. The second was in 2023, when the Commission said their name was too controversial to honor. Both decisions were rooted in the same fear, the fear of centering black men in the narrative of American power. And now, because of that fear, we face the third betrayal. The return of the ghost. The loophole has been found. The political will is there. The anti-woke crusade needs a victory, and turning liberty back into Bragg is the ultimate trophy. Imagine the scene if this happens. Imagine a young black paratrooper, a member of the 82nd Airborne, driving through the gates in 2026. He knows the history. He knows about the triple nickels. He knows they were denied. And now, he looks up and sees the name Bragg restored in fresh paint. He sees that his country looked at the history of slavery, looked at the history of treason, and then looked at the history of black heroism, and decided that the traitor was more important to its heritage than the hero. That is not just a name change. That is a statement of values. That is a declaration that some history matters more than others. It is a confirmation that in the eyes of the system, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion is still, 80 years later, the test platoon, an experiment that America is not quite ready to make permanent. The tragedy of Fort Liberty is that it was supposed to be the end of the conversation. Instead, it was just a pause. A weak, silent interval before the old order came roaring back. And the ghosts of the triple nickels, who jumped into fire to save this country, are left waiting in the smoke, wondering when, if ever, their service will be enough to earn them a place on the map. They were the smoke jumpers, the men who fought the fire. But the fire they are fighting now is the burning of their own memory. And this time, they do not have the tools to put it out. Only we do. We are now standing on the precipice of the third and final betrayal. It is no longer a theoretical threat. The machinery is already in motion. As the political winds shift in Washington, the promise to restore heritage is moving from a campaign slogan to a policy mandate. The plan to bring back the name Fort Bragg is not just about nostalgia. It is a calculated act of dominance. It is a way of saying that the brief moment of reckoning we witnessed in 2020 was a fluke, an error, and that the old order is returning to set things right. And here is the most cynical part of the plan, the detail that exposes the absolute moral bankruptcy of this effort. The legal team for the incoming administration knows they cannot technically name a base after a Confederate general. The 2021 law forbids it. So, they have found the loophole. They have found the workaround. They are not going to name it after General Braxton Bragg. They are scouring the archives, looking for a Private Bragg, a Corporal Bragg, perhaps a Union soldier from the Civil War or a draftee from Vietnam who happens to share the same last name. They will hold a ceremony. They will smile for the cameras. They will say, "Look, we are honoring a veteran. We are complying with the law. But everyone will know the truth. The signs on I-95 will not change. The patches on the uniforms will not change. The culture of the base will not change. It will be Fort Bragg again. The Private Bragg, they find, will just be a human shield, a prop used to smuggle the Confederate general back onto his pedestal. It is a lie told with a straight face, a legal sleight of hand designed to insult the intelligence of every black soldier serving on that base. It tells them, we care more about preserving the name of a white supremacist than we do about your dignity. And we will twist the law into knots to do it. Contrast this cynicism with the reality of the men they are refusing to honor. Look at the ledger. On one side, you have Braxton Bragg, a man who resigned his commission in the U.S. Army to fight against it. A man who was described by his own contemporaries as irascible, incompetent, and hated. A man who lost battles at Perryville, Stones River, and Chattanooga. A man whose greatest contribution to history was fighting a war to ensure that human beings could be bought and sold like cattle. This is the heritage they are fighting so desperately to save. On the other side of the ledger, you have the triple nickels. Men who fought to get into the U.S. Army when it did not want them. Men who perfected the art of jumping out of planes when the world said they lacked the courage. Men who, when denied the chance to fight in Europe, did not mutiny or quit. They strapped on football helmets and jumped into burning forests to save American soil from a foreign attack. Men like Melvin Brown, who died alone in the Oregon wilderness, his body broken on the rocks, miles from home, protecting a country that forced him to sit in the back of the bus. Which of these is the definition of a patriot? Which of these represents the best of America? The choice between Fort Bragg and Fort Triple Nickel is not a choice between two versions of history. It is a choice between treason and loyalty. It is a choice between a past we should be ashamed of and a past we should be weeping with pride over. And yet, the system is choosing the traitor. Why? Because the traitor is comfortable. The traitor reinforces the hierarchy. The triple nickels disrupt it. Honoring them forces a conversation about why they were segregated, why they were kept home, why Melvin Brown is not a household name. And that is a conversation the powers that be are desperate to avoid. If the name Bragg returns, it will be the final nail in the coffin of the triple nickels legacy. It will be the completion of the erasure that began in 1947. It will send a message to every young black paratrooper earning their wings today. You are welcome to bleed for us. You are welcome to die for us. But do not expect us to remember you. Do not expect us to name our houses after you. The house belongs to the master. You just live here. This is the tragedy of the Liberty Compromise. By trying to please everyone, the Commission left the door open for the ghosts to return. They treated history as something to be sanitized, rather than something to be reckoned with. They failed to understand that you cannot defeat a specific symbol of hate with a generic symbol of virtue. You must defeat it with a specific symbol of better virtue. You must replace the villain with the hero. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a duty. The government has failed. The army bureaucracy has failed. The political leadership has failed. The story of the triple nickels has been abandoned by the institutions that should be guarding it. That means the guardianship falls to us. We must become the archivists. We must be the ones to say the names. Melvin Brown. Walter Morris. Roger Walden. The men who wore the 3 5s. We must tell the story of Operation Firefly not as a footnote, but as a headline. We must share the image of the buffalo with the parachute. We must make their legend so loud, so undeniable, that no amount of political whitewashing can paint over it. They want you to think that Fort Liberty is enough. They want you to think that the return of Fort Bragg is just heritage. They are counting on your silence. They are counting on the fact that 80 years is a long time, and that memories fade. But fire leaves a scar. The triple nickels jumped into the fire to save us. Now, we must jump into the fire to save them. We cannot let them be the forgotten battalion any longer. They were the first. They were the best. And they were betrayed 3 times. Once by the generals who would not send them to war. Once by the politicians who would not speak their name. And now, by a system that wants to replace them with the very evil they signed up to fight. Melvin Brown lies in a grave in Maryland. For decades, his family did not even know exactly how he died, because the mission was classified. He gave everything. He asked for nothing. The least we can do, the absolute bare minimum we owe him, is to ensure that the country he died for knows his name. The battle for the name of the base may be lost. The sign on the gate may change back. But the battle for the truth is never over. The triple nickels earned their wings. They earned their place in the sky. And no politician, no executive order, and no bronze statue of a Confederate failure can ever take that away from them. They are the triple nickels. They came out fighting. And so must we. You actually watched till the end? Respect. Say, I did in the comments so I know who the real ones are. Do not let them be erased. Share this story. Speak their names. Because if we do not remember them, no one else will. The third betrayal only happens if we let it. And this time, we have to hold the line.